The two colored-eyed bride arrived at the wrong ranch. But the little girl whispered. The Montana Territory in 1885 was a land of second chances and shattered dreams, where the wind carried both promises and lies across endless miles of sage and stone. Mail-order brides were common, desperate women seeking refuge in the arms of lonely men who needed anyone to share the brutal beauty of frontier life. But what happens when fate intervenes, when a simple mistake becomes divine intervention? When the bride meant for one man's carefully ordered world ends up at the doorstep of another's broken heart? Evangeline Morrison clutched her carpetbag with white knuckles as the stagecoach disappeared into a cloud of dust, leaving her stranded at a crossroads that would change 3 lives forever. She was supposed to be plain, forgettable, invisible. Instead, she carried a mark that made children cross themselves and grown men look away, eyes of 2 different colors, one blue as a summer sky, one brown as rich earth. The wooden sign before her read, "Devil's Backbone Ranch," not the Harmony Valley Ranch from her crumpled letter. But sometimes the wrong road leads to the right destination. What do you think happened next? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Devil's Backbone Ranch crouched beneath towering pines like a cathedral built for mourning. Evangeline stood at the gate, her travel-worn dress whipping in the mountain wind, one hand clutching the letter that had promised her a new life. The massive log house loomed before her, its windows dark as secrets, its wraparound porch empty as a held breath. This was wrong. All wrong. She pulled the small veil lower over her face, hiding the curse that had followed her from childhood. In Chicago, the neighborhood children had whispered "witch girl" when she passed. Here, in this vast emptiness, she had hoped to disappear into normalcy, to be just another mail-order bride grateful for shelter and asking no questions. The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo across the valley. The man who emerged was a giant carved from the landscape itself, broad shoulders that could bear the weight of mountains, hands scarred by honest work, and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over granite peaks. His dark hair was touched with premature gray at the temples, and his face held the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of wrestling with an unforgiving land. He stopped on the porch, studying her with a confusion that bordered on suspicion. "Miss," his voice was rough velvet, unused to conversation. "You lost." Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm looking for Thomas Hartwell, of Harmony Valley Ranch. I'm—" The words stuck in her throat like thorns. "I'm his bride." Something shifted in the giant's expression. Not relief, not welcome, something colder. "This is Devil's Backbone Ranch. I'm Josiah Blackthorne. No Hartwell here." The world tilted on its axis. She pulled out the letter, hands trembling. But the driver said mile marker 23. He said this was the place. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated herself for the weakness. Josiah descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate. He was close enough now that she could see the deep lines around his eyes, the map of loss etched into his features. Harmony Valley's 5 miles east. Driver must have gotten confused. He paused, studying her veiled face with an intensity that made her skin burn. "You can't stay here." "Papa," the voice was small as a moth's wing, sweet as wildflower honey. They both turned. On the porch stood a little girl with copper curls that caught the dying sunlight like spun fire. 7 years old, maybe 8, with eyes too ancient for her face and a dress that had seen better days. She held a rag doll close to her chest, and her gaze was fixed on Evangeline, with something that looked dangerously like hope. "Ruby, go inside." Josiah's voice gentled, but underneath was steel. The child didn't move. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood at the edge of the porch. "You have different eyes," she whispered, and somehow those 4 words held more wonder than fear. Evangeline's hand flew to her veil, but it was too late. The wind had caught it, lifting it just enough to reveal what she'd spent a lifetime hiding. One eye blue as heaven, one brown as earth. Ruby smiled. It was the first smile that had ever greeted Evangeline's strangeness without malice. God finally sent you to us. The words hung in the mountain air like morning mist, impossible and fragile. Josiah's face went white as winter bone, and Evangeline felt the earth shift beneath her feet. "Ruby," Josiah's voice was strangled. "What did you say?" But the little girl was already moving her bare feet silent on the wooden steps. She stopped directly in front of Evangeline, tilting her head like a curious bird. "I've been praying so long," she whispered, her words meant only for Evangeline's ears. "I knew you'd have special eyes. One for seeing the world, one for seeing hearts." Evangeline knelt slowly, bringing herself to Ruby's level. Up close, she could see the child's eyes were green gold like sunlight through leaves and held depths that spoke of sorrows too heavy for small shoulders. "How did you know?" Evangeline asked softly. Ruby glanced back at her father, then leaned closer. "Mama told me, in my dreams. She said to watch for the lady with heaven eyes." The words hit Josiah like a physical blow. He stepped backward, one hand braced against the porch rail. "Ruby, that's enough. Go inside, now." But Ruby's small hand had already found Evangeline's, warm and trusting. "Don't go," she pleaded. "Please don't go. Mama said you'd come when we needed you most." Evangeline looked from the child's desperate face to the man's stricken one. In the growing twilight, the ranch felt like a place holding its breath, waiting for someone to exhale and let the ghosts out. "I should go," Evangeline said, though every instinct screamed against it. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You can't." Ruby's grip tightened. "It's getting dark. Papa says the mountain gets hungry at night." Josiah closed his eyes, a man fighting a war with himself. When he opened them, resignation had settled in their depths, like sediment in still water. "One night," he said roughly. "Storm's coming anyway. Road to Harmony Valley won't be safe in the dark." As if summoned by his words, thunder rumbled in the distance. Inside the house was a museum of careful preservation. Every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that spoke of hands desperate for purpose. The furniture was solid, well made, but covered in the dust of disuse. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, but one frame sat face down, as if the image it held was too painful to witness. Ruby led Evangeline to a chair by the massive stone fireplace. "This was Mama's favorite spot," she said matter-of-factly. "She liked to watch the fire dance while she mended Papa's shirts." Josiah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as he moved to light the kindling. "What happened to your mama?" Evangeline asked gently. Ruby's smile faltered. She fell off Starlight. "Her horse. 3 years ago. Papa says sometimes the good angels need help in heaven, so God calls them home early." She looked directly at Evangeline with those two wise eyes. "But I think God sent you because he knew we still needed an angel down here." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of flames finding their voice. Later, as Ruby slept in her small bed upstairs, Josiah and Evangeline sat across from each other at the kitchen table, a gulf of unspoken words between them. "She hasn't talked to a stranger in 3 years," Josiah said finally. His hands wrapped around a coffee cup knuckles, white with tension. "After Sarah died, Ruby, she went somewhere inside herself. Only talks to me, and only when she has to." Evangeline studied his profile in the lamplight. "But she talked to me." "Yeah." His voice was rough with wonder and something that might have been fear. "She did." Outside, the storm broke against the mountains like a fist against stone. Dawn came soft and apologetic, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Evangeline woke in the guest room to the sound of small feet in the hallway and the smell of coffee brewing below. Through the window, she could see the ranch spreading out in the valley like a promise, kept rolling pastures, a red barn weathered to the color of old blood, and mountains that stood sentinel against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She had slept better than she had in months. Downstairs, Ruby was already at the stove, standing on a wooden crate to reach the griddle. Her copper curls were tamed into 2 neat braids, and she hummed a tune that sounded like church bells carried on wind. "Good morning," Evangeline said softly. Ruby turned with a smile that could have lit the entire valley. "I'm making flapjacks. Mama taught me before." She caught herself, the smile wavering. Before she went to heaven. Evangeline moved to stand beside her. "Can I help?" For the next hour, they worked in companionable silence, Ruby chattering about everything and nothing, while Evangeline marveled at the child's resilience. She spoke of her father's horses, the barn cat, who'd had kittens the way the mountains looked different every day, like they were trying on new clothes. "Do you think Mama would like you?" Ruby asked, suddenly pouring batter onto the hot griddle. The question caught Evangeline off guard. "I don't know, sweetheart. What do you think?" Ruby considered this with the gravity of a judge. "I think she'd like your eyes. She always said the most beautiful things were the ones that were different." She flipped a pancake with surprising skill, like how every snowflake is special, even though they're all snow. When Josiah came in from the morning chores, he stopped in the doorway like a man seeing ghosts. Ruby was setting the table, while Evangeline poured syrup into a small ceramic pitcher, Sarah's pitcher, from the look on his face. "Smells good," he said carefully. They ate in a silence that felt less like tension and more like the careful exploration of new territory. Ruby kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking Evangeline about Chicago, about her journey west, about whether she'd ever seen snow that came up to her waist. "Tell me about Thomas Hartwell," Josiah said finally, and something in his tone made Evangeline's stomach clench. "I don't know him well," she admitted. "We corresponded. He wanted someone practical, someone who wouldn't expect romance or grand gestures, someone grateful for a roof and regular meals." Ruby wrinkled her nose. "That sounds boring." "Ruby," Josiah warned, but his eyes held a flicker of something that might have been amusement. "Well, it does," Ruby said defiantly. "Mama always said love should be like fireworks, not like oatmeal." Despite himself, Josiah's mouth twitched. "Your mama said a lot of things." "She was smart," Ruby said simply. Then, to Evangeline, "Did you want to marry him? Really want to?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Evangeline found herself looking into Ruby's earnest face and couldn't find it in herself to lie. "I wanted to be safe," she said finally. "Sometimes wanting safety is all a person can manage." Ruby nodded solemnly. "Mama used to say that sometimes God changes our wants when He knows what we really need." After breakfast, Ruby insisted on showing Evangeline the ranch. They walked hand in hand across the pasture, Ruby pointing out landmarks and telling stories about each horse, each building, each tree that held meaning. "That's where Papa built Mama's garden," she said, pointing to a patch of earth surrounded by a white picket fence. "Nothing grows there now. Papa says the soil's gone sad." The garden was a tangle of weeds and broken dreams, but Evangeline could see the bones of beauty beneath the neglect, the careful layout of raised beds, the trellis that had once supported climbing roses, the small wooden bench positioned to catch the morning sun. Maybe it just needs someone to remember how to make things grow, Evangeline said softly. Ruby squeezed her hand. "I think you could do it. You have growing hands." "How do you know?" Ruby smiled up at her. "Because you made Papa smile at breakfast. Nobody's done that in a long time." The riders appeared at noon, like harbingers of a reckoning long overdue. Evangeline was in the garden pulling weeds with Ruby's enthusiastic help when the sound of hoofbeats broke the mountain quiet. Three men rode hard up the drive, dust trailing behind them like smoke from a funeral pyre. The man in the lead was small and sharp-featured, with the kind of eyes that took inventory of everything they saw. His clothes were expensive but practical, and he wore his authority like a weapon barely sheathed. Thomas Hartwell. Even without introduction, Evangeline knew. Ruby pressed close to her side, suddenly shy. "Papa," she whispered. Josiah emerged from the barn, his face carefully blank, but Evangeline could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He walked with the measured pace of a man approaching a fight he didn't want, but wouldn't back down from. "Hartwell," Josiah said, stopping a careful distance from the mounted men. "Blackthorn." Thomas dismounted with practiced efficiency. Behind him, two other men remained in their saddles. Sheriff Mills, recognizable by his badge, and another man whose face held the kind of hardness that came from being paid to look intimidating. Thomas's gaze swept the ranch with proprietary interest before settling on Evangeline. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirts, and felt his eyes cataloging her like livestock at auction. "Miss Morrison," he said, and his voice held disappointment like a bitter aftertaste. "You've caused quite a stir. When you didn't arrive yesterday, I assumed the worst." "I'm sorry," Evangeline began, but Thomas raised a hand to silence her. "No harm done. Though I must say, your appearance is not what I expected from your letters." His gaze lingered on her face, and she realized with growing horror that her veil had slipped during the morning's work. Ruby stepped forward, small chin lifted defiantly. "She's beautiful," the child declared. "God made her special." Thomas's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Special? Yes, I can see that." He looked directly at Evangeline's mismatched eyes, and his expression shifted from disappointment to disgust. "Marked by the devil, more like. No wonder you kept that particular detail from your correspondence." The words hit like physical blows. Evangeline felt 7 years old again, standing in the schoolyard, while children pointed and whispered. She reached for her veil, but Ruby's small hand caught hers. "No," Ruby said firmly. "Don't hide." Josiah took a step forward, his voice deadly quiet. "That's enough." "Is it?" Thomas turned his cold attention to Josiah. "This woman is bound by contract to marry me. Legal papers witnessed and signed. Whatever hospitality you've shown her is appreciated, but she belongs with me now." "I don't belong to anyone," Evangeline said, finding her voice at last. But even as she spoke, she could feel the weight of the contract in her carpetbag upstairs. Legal papers, witnessed and signed. Thomas smiled, and it was a predator's expression. "Actually, Miss Morrison, you do. The contract is quite specific about the penalties for breach. You owe me compensation for travel expenses, room and board, and damages for misrepresentation. Unless you have $300 hidden in that bag of yours. The sum might as well have been 3,000. Evangeline's heart sank like a stone in deep water. Sheriff Mills shifted in his saddle. "The law's the law, Blackthorn. Contract's binding." Ruby's grip on Evangeline's hand tightened to the point of pain. "She can't go," the child whispered, and there was such desperation in her voice that it cut through the adult's tension like a blade. "She can't. Mama said, your mama's dead, child." Thomas interrupted with casual cruelty. "Dead people don't send messages." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When Josiah spoke, his voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "Get off my land." Thomas's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "I'm afraid that's not possible. I have legal claim to Miss Morrison, and I intend to collect what's mine." He gestured to the third man, who dismounted with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. "Mr. Kane here ensures that legal claims are respected." Ruby began to cry, not the loud sobs of childhood, but the quiet, desperate tears of someone watching their world crumble again. It was more than Evangeline could bear. "I'll come," she said, the words tearing from her throat like pieces of her soul. "Give me 10 minutes to pack." "No!" Ruby's cry was a hawk's shriek in the mountain air. "No, no, no. You can't. You're supposed to stay. Mama promised." Evangeline knelt beside the sobbing child, her own heart breaking into 1,000 sharp pieces. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." But as she looked up at Josiah's stricken face, she saw something in his storm-gray eyes that hadn't been there before. The look of a man preparing for war. That night, Ruby refused to eat. She sat at the kitchen table, small arms crossed her face, set in lines of stubborn grief that made her look far older than her 7 years. "She's not really gone," Ruby whispered to her father as he tried to coax her to take just one bite of bread. "She'll come back. Mama told me." Josiah's patience stretched thin by watching Evangeline ride away with Thomas Hartwell finally snapped. "Ruby, enough. Your mama is dead. She doesn't tell you anything. And Miss Evangeline, she belongs somewhere else now." Ruby's eyes flashed with a fury that would have been frightening if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. "Mama's not dead," she said fiercely. "She talks to me every night. She said the lady with heaven eyes would come and make you smile again. She said we'd be a family." "We are a family," Josiah said desperately. "You and me. We're enough." "No." Ruby pushed away from the table, her chair scraping against the floor like fingernails on slate. "No, we're not. You don't smile. You don't laugh. You don't sing anymore. Mama said you used to sing all the time." The words hit Josiah like hammer blows. He knelt beside his daughter's chair, his big hands gentle on her thin shoulders. "Ruby, baby, I can't. You can't." What love someone knew Mama said that was okay. She said, "Love isn't like pie. There's always enough for more people." Ruby's voice cracked. "But you sent her away. You let that mean man take her." Josiah closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids he saw Evangeline's face when Thomas had looked at her with such disgust. He saw her straighten her spine and lift her chin, dignity wrapped around her like armor. He saw her kneel beside Ruby, promising things would be all right, even as her own world crumbled. He had done nothing, said nothing. Let her walk away because it was easier than fighting for something that scared him more than death itself. The possibility of love. Again. "Papa," Ruby's voice was small, now uncertain. "Are you crying?" He was. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. "Yeah, baby, I'm crying." Ruby's small arms wound around his neck. "It's okay to cry. Mama said tears are just love with nowhere to go." They held each other in the lamplight, two broken hearts learning to beat in rhythm again. 5 miles away at Harmony Valley Ranch, Evangeline sat by a window that looked out onto flat, uninspiring pasture. The house was neat, efficient, cold as a tomb. Thomas had made his expectations clear over a dinner that tasted like sawdust. She would cook clean bear children and be grateful for the privilege. Her eyes were an unfortunate quirk that he would overlook in exchange for her complete obedience. "You'll fit in well here," he had said, cutting his meat with precise economical movements. "I've already spoken to the minister about covering those unusual features during the ceremony. A heavier veil should suffice." She had nodded and said nothing because, what was there to say, this was what she had agreed to. Safety in exchange for silence. Security in exchange for her soul. But as she stared out at the darkness, she couldn't stop thinking about Ruby's laugh, or the way Josiah's eyes had softened when he watched his daughter smile, or the feeling of rich earth between her fingers in Sarah's abandoned garden. She couldn't stop thinking about what it felt like to be wanted instead of merely tolerated. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The housekeeper, a sour-faced woman named Mrs. Potts, stood in the doorway with a cup of tea and an expression of grim duty. "Mr. Hartwell thought you might need something to help you sleep," she said, setting the cup on the bedside table. "Big day tomorrow. Wedding's at noon." Wedding. The word sat in Evangeline's stomach like a stone. After Mrs. Potts left, Evangeline picked up the teacup, then set it down untouched. Instead, she moved to her carpetbag and pulled out the one thing she had never been able to throw away, a small daguerreotype of her parents taken before the consumption claimed them both. They had loved each other with a fierce, joyful devotion that had made their small tenement apartment feel like a palace. "What should I do?" she whispered to their faded images. But she already knew the answer. It had been written in a 7-year-old's tears and a broken man's silence. It lived in the memory of strong hands, gentle with horses, and the way sunlight looked different when it fell across Devil's Backbone Ranch. Some chances came once in a lifetime. Some choices couldn't be undone. But some hearts, once awakened, refused to go back to sleep. She was reaching for her cloak when she heard it the sound of hoofbeats in the night, urgent and desperate. She moved to the window and saw a lone rider approaching his horse lathered with effort. Even in the darkness she knew the set of those shoulders. Josiah had come for her. The church in Harmony Valley was a small whitewashed building that squatted against the morning sky like a disapproving ant. By 11:30 it was half full of curious townspeople who had come to witness Thomas Hartwell's wedding to the mysterious mail-order bride with the strange eyes. Evangeline stood in the vestry dressed in a simple blue dress that Thomas had deemed suitable, her face hidden behind a heavy veil that turned the world into shadows. Her hands shook as she smoothed the fabric, and she could hear the murmur of voices beyond the door neighbors speculating about the bride who had arrived at the wrong ranch and the broken rancher who had let her go. Mrs. Potts fussed around her like a mournful crow, adjusting the veil and muttering about the impropriety of such a hasty ceremony. "Should have waited for the banns to be read proper," she complained. "But Mr. Hartwell wants it done quick. Says there's been enough talk already." Through the window, Evangeline could see Thomas in the churchyard accepting congratulations with the satisfaction of a man who had reclaimed stolen property. He looked prosperous, respectable, settled everything a practical woman should want in a husband. So why did her heart feel like it was dying? The church door opened with a bang that silenced every conversation. All heads turned as Josiah Blackthorne walked down the aisle, his face a thundercloud, Ruby's small hand clasped firmly in his. The child's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but her jaw was set with determination that made her look like a tiny warrior. "Stop!" Josiah said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small building. "This wedding can't happen." Thomas stepped forward, his face mottling with anger. "You have no authority here, Blackthorne. This is a legal ceremony built on a lie," Josiah interrupted. He looked directly at the vestry door as if he could see through the wood to where Evangeline stood frozen. "She doesn't want this. I can see it in her eyes, both of them." Ruby broke free from her father's grip and ran toward the vestry. "Angel Lady," she called, "don't marry the mean man. Come home with us." The church erupted in shocked murmurs. Thomas grabbed Ruby's arm, his fingers digging into her thin flesh. Someone control this child. What happened next would be talked about in Harmony Valley for years to come. Josiah moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to handling spooked horses and dangerous situations. One moment, Thomas was gripping Ruby's arm. The next, he was flat on his back with Josiah's boot on his chest and murder in the rancher's storm-gray eyes. "Touch my daughter again," Josiah said softly, "and they'll bury what's left of you in a matchbox." The vestry door flew open. Evangeline rushed out, her veil trailing behind her like a banner of surrender. She dropped to her knees beside Ruby, gathering the sobbing child into her arms. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here? Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life," Ruby hiccuped. Papa finally remembered how to fight for what he loves. Evangeline looked up to find Josiah standing over them, his eyes holding everything he had been too afraid to say. "Ruby's right," he said roughly. "I've been a coward. Lost my wife and thought my heart was buried with her. But these past 2 days—" He knelt beside them, his big hands gentle as he lifted the heavy veil from Evangeline's face. In the church's morning light, her mismatched eyes were luminous, one blue as heaven, one brown as the earth that gives life to all growing things. "These past 2 days I remembered what it feels like to be alive," he finished. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is outrageous. She's bound by contract. Sheriff arrests them for theft." But Sheriff Mills was looking at the 3 figures kneeling together, the broken rancher, the marked woman, and the child who held them both together with threads of stubborn love. His hand stayed well away from his gun. "Seems to me," the sheriff said slowly, "a contract signed under false pretenses isn't worth the paper it's written on. You told me she was willing and eager. That doesn't look like eagerness to me." Ruby stood up, her small frame vibrating with righteous fury. "And you're mean," she announced to Thomas. "Mama says mean people don't get to marry angels." The congregation tittered. Thomas looked around the church, seeing his reputation crumbling in real time. "You'll regret this, Blackthorne," he snarled. "All of you will regret this." "Maybe," Josiah said, rising to his feet and helping Evangeline stand. "But I already regret not fighting for her sooner." He turned to Evangeline, his heart in his eyes. "I know this is crazy. I know we barely know each other. But Ruby's right. Sometimes God changes our plans because He knows what we really need." He took her hands in his calloused fingers, intertwining with soft ones. "Stay with us, not as someone running from something, but as someone running toward home." Evangeline looked into his face, weathered by sun and sorrow, but transformed by hope. She looked at Ruby, who was bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. She looked at the church, full of people who had come to witness one wedding and were about to see something entirely different. "I love you," she said simply. "Both of you. I think I have since the moment Ruby called me an angel." Ruby whooped with joy. The congregation burst into spontaneous applause, and somewhere in the sound of celebration and joy, the ghost of a woman who had loved them first seemed to give her blessing to the new family being born. Minister Thompson cleared his throat. "Well," he said, struggling not to smile, "if we're going to do this, we might as well do it properly. Mr. Blackthorne, Miss Morrison, if you'd take your places." And 1 hour later, they rode back to Devil's Backbone Ranch as husband and wife Ruby, chattering excitedly about having 2 mamas now, one in heaven and one on earth. As they crested the hill overlooking the valley, Evangeline saw their home spread out below them like a promise kept. "Welcome to the family," Josiah said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Evangeline smiled, her veil abandoned forever. Her face turned toward the sun that made her unusual eyes shine like jewels. "I've been waiting my whole life to come home." And in the garden that had gone sad without love, the first green shoots of spring pushed through the earth, ready to bloom again. Did this story touch your heart? Hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of unexpected love and second chances. What's your favorite part? Ruby's wisdom, Josiah's transformation, or Evangeline finally finding her place? Let us know in the comments below.